Flight crew calls security on black woman. Then she reveals she's a Federal Aviation official. You won't believe how a routine flight from Chicago O'Hare International Airport turned into a firestorm of accusations, racial profiling, and stunning revelations. It all starts with a confident black woman named Nicole Thompson, quiet, composed, and seemingly an ordinary passenger. But when the flight crew singles her out and calls security, no one on board imagines the explosive secret she holds. Whispers echo through the cabin. Who is she? Why does she seem so calm under pressure? Moments later, the shocking truth emerges. Nicole is a high-ranking Federal Aviation Administration official on a critical mission. And that's when the real drama begins. Nicole Thompson woke at 4 in the morning, her heart pounding with both excitement and a hint of anxiety. She had a habit of mentally rehearsing the day's events before her feet even touched the floor. Today was no ordinary trip. As a Federal Aviation Administration FAA inspector, she was used to traveling under discrete circumstances, but this trip felt more significant. Rumors had been swirling about persistent infractions on several major airlines, and the FAA had dispatched Nicole to investigate quietly. It was a job she took seriously, especially as one of the few black women in her position. Standing at her bathroom mirror, Nicole brushed her hair into a sleek bun and recounted every step she would take that day, checking in at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, boarding her flight to New York's LaGuardia, and documenting airline staff behavior and compliance. She reminded herself, as she often did, that her identity was not just a badge. It was a beacon of progress, proof that, despite the stacked odds, she had persevered and excelled. On the train ride to the airport, she looked out at the passing skyline. Chicago, her hometown, never ceased to amaze her with its towering architecture. Yet the bustling city also reminded her of the many challenges she had overcome. Growing up on the South Side with limited means, Nicole had worked tirelessly for scholarships that eventually propelled her into a career in aviation. Early on, she learned never to underestimate the power of making your presence known in subtle ways. Sometimes, it was better to keep your identity hidden until the right moment. Walking into O'Hare's Terminal 3 felt like stepping into a world of organized chaos. Passengers hurried past, dragging suitcases, checking phone notifications, eyes darting to departure screens. Airport announcements chimed overhead, delivering instructions in a soothing yet sterile voice. Nicole took a deep breath, approached the check-in kiosk, and obtained her boarding pass. Her seat assignment, 14A, was tucked into the heart of economy class. From there, she would observe everything: how flight attendants interacted with passengers, whether they followed safety protocols, and how the airline handled in-flight announcements. Nicole was familiar with the subtle tension of traveling as a professional in civilian attire. She had done it countless times. Sometimes she had been ignored, treated kindly, or even singled out. Not that she wore her official capacity on her sleeve, she preferred blending in. Only this time, she couldn't shake an odd feeling. The day's atmosphere felt charged, as if something significant would happen. Stepping away from the kiosk, she noticed a group of gate agents whispering among themselves. Probably routine chatter, she told herself. She walked toward an airport cafe to buy a bottle of water and a quick snack. While she waited in line, a text message flashed on her phone screen: "Best of luck. Keep me posted," from her colleague, Darren, who worked in FAA enforcement. Darren knew she was on a mission to observe this particular airline after a string of passenger complaints. Nicole inhaled deeply, mentally rehearsing her checklist. Yes, she would keep an eye on seatbelt demonstrations, beverage service, pilot announcements, emergency equipment stowage, and even how the flight crew responded to passenger requests. So far, Everything appeared normal, except for the nagging sense that her presence might soon spark conflict. In her experiences, certain prejudices had ways of surfacing at the worst times. At the boarding gate, she joined the line of economy passengers. Two flight attendants stood at the jet bridge entrance, scanning boarding passes with forced smiles. One of them, a tall man with combed-back hair, glanced at Nicole, did a double take, then looked away. There was a fleeting sense of unease in his posture, but Nicole shrugged it off. Perhaps he was just tired or stressed. She stepped onto the aircraft, heading toward seat 14A, unaware that the drama unfolding would soon become a life-altering event, not only for her, but for everyone on that plane. Sliding into her seat, Nicole felt the familiar hum of the engines beneath her. The air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and cleaning solution. She settled her carry-on under the seat in front of her, careful to keep the small black folder with her credentials zipped away in her purse. The last thing she wanted was to blow her cover so early in the flight. She needed to see how the crew behaved toward all passengers, especially those who might appear less privileged or who could be easily overlooked. People continued to shuffle down the narrow aisle. A tired mother coaxed her toddler forward. A business traveler in a sharp suit looked impatiently at his phone. An elderly couple debated whether they were in the correct row. Flight attendants escorted them toward their assigned seats. Nicole took mental notes. So far, so good standard courtesy, no glaring lapses. She reminded herself that, as an inspector, her job required her to notice both the small kindnesses and the minor slights. Sometimes the biggest clues emerged from how staff treated the seemingly mundane. Moments later, the tall flight attendant from earlier stopped at Nicole's row. His name badge read Vincent. He scanned the overhead bins, appeared to verify seat numbers, then quickly turned his gaze to Nicole. An odd flicker crossed his face, a look she had seen before, some mixture of suspicion and forced politeness. "Ma'am, are you all set?" Vincent asked, voice clipped. "Yes, I'm fine," Nicole replied. She offered a polite smile, determined not to betray her internal sense of watchfulness. Vincent lingered for a second before nodding curtly and continuing up the aisle. Nicole exhaled quietly. Maybe she was imagining things. She certainly hoped so. A single flight attendant's discomfort wouldn't necessarily indicate a systemic problem. Still, her intuition had guided her successfully in the past, and she refused to ignore it. Passengers continued to board. Eventually, the pilot made an announcement welcoming everyone to Omega Airlines Flight 717 bound for New York. He ran through the usual pre-flight spiel, expected flight time, weather conditions, and a friendly thank you for choosing Omega. Nicole glanced around. Nothing out of the ordinary. If an issue existed, it might reveal itself mid-flight, where the real interactions happened. People get tired, cramped, and easily annoyed, especially on busy morning flights. Sure enough, as soon as the cabin doors closed and the plane began to taxi, an air of tension seeped into the economy cabin. A young man wrestled with his seatbelt. A flight attendant scolded a passenger for leaving her seat in search of the restroom. Nicole paid close attention to the flight attendant's tone of voice and body language. Were they being overly harsh or simply trying to enforce rules? She had to remain objective, even though she felt an underlying current of unease. The overhead speakers crackled. Another flight attendant, a woman named Tanya, began the safety demonstration. Nicole compared it to the FAA guidelines in her mind. So far, it aligned. The demonstration ended smoothly and the plane lifted into the sky. Through the window, Nicole watched Chicago's skyline shrink beneath a swirl of morning clouds. As the flight leveled off, the seatbelt sign switched off, and flight attendants started beverage service. Nicole saw Vincent weaving through the aisle again, handing out tiny bags of pretzels or peanuts and cans of soft drinks. When he reached Nicole's row, she noticed that he lingered a beat longer, glancing at her ID tags on her purse, which she had discreetly covered. He must have noticed the official FAA design, but it was subtle, just the small golden letters embroidered on a corner. He handed Nicole a can of ginger ale without a word, then turned to the passenger across the aisle with a forced smile that instantly vanished once he moved on. Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in Nicole's mind. She took the ginger ale, sipped it, and tried to focus on her job. There was no rule stating flight attendants had to be overly friendly, but courtesy was generally expected. Was Vincent's stiffness purely personal discomfort, or was it rooted in bias? Nicole felt that old, familiar tension under her skin, the sense of walking through a field riddled with hidden tripwires. Her phone buzzed in airplane mode, reminding her that she'd be unreachable for a while. Nicole closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the tension. She told herself that everything might still go smoothly. Perhaps Vincent was just having a bad day. Little did she know, the seeds of conflict had already been planted. The slightest nudge in the wrong direction could set the entire flight on a collision course with chaos. And Nicole, as both a silent observer and unwilling participant, was about to be caught squarely in the middle. Roughly an hour into the flight, the cabin felt restless. Occasional turbulence rattled the overhead bins, prompting the pilot to illuminate the seatbelt sign once again. Nicole was used to mild turbulence, but some passengers clutched their armrests with white-knuckled grips. A few children wailed, while the mother from earlier tried to soothe her toddler with a juice box and a soft lullaby. Nicole kept her gaze peeled on Vincent and the other flight attendants. Tanya moved briskly, attending to the more panicked travelers. In contrast, Vincent seemed to hover near the front galley, frequently looking over his shoulder in Nicole's direction. Each time she caught his eye, he flicked his head away as if embarrassed. Perhaps he was trying to place her face. Maybe he suspected she was someone important, but not quite sure who. Then came the bump that no one expected. The plane lurched violently, sending a collective gasp through the cabin. Several passengers shrieked. The pilot's voice crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We've hit a patch of severe turbulence." Even Nicole's heart skipped a beat. This was more than the usual jostle. After about 30 agonizing seconds, the plane finally stabilized. A wave of nervous laughter and relieved sighs coursed through the cabin. Then the seatbelt sign blinked off. A handful of passengers tentatively made their way to the restrooms. Nicole noticed an older gentleman, 2 rows ahead, pressing his call button. He looked pale and slightly disoriented. Vincent arrived to assist, but Nicole heard the old man say, "I'm feeling faint. Could I have some water, please?" Vincent nodded but pressed. "Do you have a medical condition? Any special medication you should be taking?" His tone was borderline aggressive. The old man was startled by the barrage of questions. Nicole frowned. The protocol for assisting a passenger feeling faint was fairly straightforward: get water, possibly oxygen if needed, and remain calm. She felt Vincent's approach was unexpectedly tense. The old man stammered that he didn't have any serious condition, just a bit of air sickness. Vincent hurried back to the galley. Meanwhile, Tanya approached from the other aisle to see if she could help, but Vincent waved her off. He returned moments later with a cup of water, his face tight with stress. Nicole watched as the old man took a few sips, then thanked Vincent softly. Through it all, Vincent cast another suspicious glance in Nicole's direction, as if worried she might be taking notes. In truth, she was, albeit mentally. She couldn't understand his hostility. Flight attendants were trained to handle nerves and minor medical issues calmly. Vincent's behavior didn't necessarily amount to official misconduct, but it certainly raised questions about his temperament. A short while later, the old man seemed to recover. He took slow, deliberate breaths, occasionally sipping water. Vincent returned to check on him once, but the concern came off as grudging. At that point, Nicole decided that if Vincent's behavior continued to escalate or targeted specific passengers unfairly, she would step in. She carried the authority to document such incidents for the FAA's investigative records. Still, she hoped it wouldn't come to that. A flight attendant's anxiety or a bad day was one thing, but an outright violation of regulations was another. Suddenly, Nicole's thoughts were interrupted by a new tension. A passenger in the aisle seat of Nicole's row got up to use the restroom, brushing past her. Vincent was walking down the aisle at that exact moment, and they collided awkwardly, causing Vincent to spill a tray of plastic cups. He hissed a curse under his breath, and his gaze darted not at the passenger, but straight to Nicole. She felt a chill. Why is he looking at me like I orchestrated this? He bent down to pick up the spilled cups, muttering something Nicole couldn't fully catch. She thought she heard a clipped remark that sounded like people need to watch where they're going, but then he said more quietly, "I'm keeping an eye on her," as he gathered the discarded cups. Her stomach tightened. There was no one else he could be referring to in that moment. Her mind raced. Did he suspect her job? Or was it something else, something uglier, an undercurrent of racial bias? She had faced subtle and not so subtle discrimination enough times to recognize the pattern. The tension building within the cabin now felt personal, but Nicole reminded herself of her training. She was here to observe, not to confront. There were protocols for lodging formal grievances if something escalated. Yet a sense of foreboding weighed on her, like a storm cloud gathering overhead. Somewhere in her gut, she knew this flight was about to take a darker turn, one that would test every ounce of her professionalism and her patience. Halfway through the flight, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to offer a more restful atmosphere. Some passengers tried to nap, headphones on and eyes shut. The in-flight entertainment screens glowed with movies and show selections. Nicole barely glanced at hers. She couldn't relax, her mind buzzing with the earlier tension. She tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe Vincent's stress was the result of some personal issue, or maybe Omega Airlines had become stricter with staff protocols under pressure from recent FAA warnings. Still, his fixation on her felt oddly specific. She decided to walk to the lavatory, both to stretch her legs and to discreetly assess the atmosphere in other sections of the plane. Rising, she noticed how Vincent watched her out of the corner of his eye from the front galley. Feeling her pulse quicken, Nicole resolved to remain calm. If anything, her role demanded neutrality. She moved slowly up the aisle, avoiding eye contact with Vincent. On her way back from the lavatory, she spotted Tanya handing out blankets to a couple of shivering passengers. Tanya saw Nicole and gave a friendly nod, asking if she needed anything. Nicole kindly declined but internally noted the contrast. Tanya's warmth was a stark difference from Vincent's chilly demeanor. Returning to seat 14A, Nicole noticed new murmurs among nearby passengers. A curly-haired woman across the aisle whispered something to her seatmate, her eyes flicking pointedly toward Nicole. Did they sense the odd dynamic in the air, or were they just remarking on how Nicole was quietly surveying the cabin? Paranoia threatened to creep in, but Nicole forced herself to remain rational. Just as she settled back into her seat, the overhead speaker chimed, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some weather updates. We might experience more turbulence as we approach the East Coast. Please stay seated with your seatbelts fastened whenever possible." Nicole braced herself for possible bumps, though the flight had been relatively smooth since the earlier jolt. Her phone, still in airplane mode, displayed the time. There were about 90 minutes left until landing. She exhaled in relief. So far, nothing had reached the level of a violation that merited an immediate report. If the flight continued without incident, she could simply note Vincent's odd behavior in her internal records, which might result in a routine follow-up or a minor review. But fate had other plans. Not 10 minutes later, the plane rocked with a brief but forceful pocket of turbulence. A few overhead compartments rattled open, and Vincent hurried to secure them. One of the compartments contained a heavy laptop bag that nearly slipped out, and Vincent managed to catch it at the last second. Exasperation flashed across his face, and as he turned to close the overhead bin, he openly glared at Nicole once again. That's when Nicole noticed something else. Another flight attendant, a younger man named Jonas, was whispering to Vincent while glancing in Nicole's direction. They both frowned, their eyes narrowing as if confirming a suspicion. Nicole's heart thudded. Was it because of her race, her presence, or the half-hidden FA tag on her purse? She felt her mouth go dry, and she decided to endure a few more minutes of this silent scrutiny before calmly confronting them. She needed to act as a professional, not an affronted passenger. In her role, it was crucial to maintain composure, gather evidence, and escalate in the correct manner if needed. Yet the tension ratcheted higher with each passing minute. More passengers began to sense the friction. A man 2 rows behind Nicole tapped the shoulder of his friend and tilted his head toward the front galley, mouthing something like, "What's going on?" The friend shrugged. Finally, Vincent began walking down the aisle with Jonas, stopping at Nicole's row. Jonas feigned a polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Vincent, standing slightly behind Jonas, folded his arms over his chest. "M.A.A.M., Jonas began tentatively. "Is everything all right here?" Nicole blinked, unsure how to respond. "Yes, everything's fine," she said carefully. Vincent cleared his throat. "We've had some concerns, that's all," he said, eyes flicking between Nicole and the seat pocket in front of her. His words hung in the air, thick with implication. Nicole felt the pulse in her temples. If she was going to address this, perhaps now was the moment. But before she could speak, Vincent added, "We just want to make sure all passengers are safe and comfortable." The statement felt like a thinly veiled accusation. Nicole forced a neutral expression. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly fine." Jonas nodded uncertainly, and they moved on, though Vincent's gaze lingered. Nicole sank into her seat. Whatever suspicion they harbored, it was about to come to a head. The flight still had over an hour left. Plenty of time for calm heads to prevail, or for the situation to spiral spectacularly out of control. An uneasy lull spread through the cabin. Passengers sensed something was amiss, but didn't have enough context to piece it together. Nicole could see them exchanging puzzled glances. A handful scrolled through phones that remained connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi, oblivious to the subtle drama. Others simply tried to fall asleep. Nicole took a moment to center herself, recalling the FAA's guidelines for conflict resolution. She had no intention of creating a scene, but as soon as the plane landed, she'd have a responsibility to file a report if she felt targeted or witnessed any form of discrimination. She fiddled with the ring on her finger, a silver band she'd purchased in her early days of flight training, a reminder of her progress. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Observe, record." A few rows ahead, a father tried to entertain his restless 7-year-old by playing a handheld game. The seatbelt sign flickered on and off as the plane crossed another patch of choppy air. Nicole watched Vincent and Jonas continue their patrol, occasionally stopping to chat quietly. Their glances at her row intensified, as if they were building a case in their minds. Finally, Nicole could stand the tension no longer. She pressed her call button. Tanya appeared within seconds, wearing a pleasant, if slightly concerned, smile. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" Nicole steadied her voice. "Tanya, could I get a refill on my ginger ale?" She paused and added, "And if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to speak with you privately for a moment." Tanya blinked, then nodded. "Of course." She went to fetch the drink and returned, kneeling slightly so as not to block the aisle. "What's on your mind?" Nicole leaned in. I've noticed Vincent and Jonas watching me quite closely. I'm just curious if there's a reason. I don't want to assume anything, but it's making me uncomfortable. Tanya's eyes flickered with understanding and maybe a hint of embarrassment. I'm really sorry. Let me see if I can find out what's going on. Sometimes, nerves run high. But I promise I'll do my best to resolve whatever concerns they may have. Nicole nodded. Thank you. Tanya left, and Nicole watched her approach Vincent and Jonas at the front galley. A brief exchange followed. Vincent shook his head emphatically, while Jonas wore a pinched expression. Tanya looked exasperated, making gestures that suggested she was trying to defuse the situation. The conversation ended with Vincent pointing down the aisle, presumably indicating Nicole. Tanya's shoulders sagged, and she returned to Nicole. I'm sorry, she repeated, her voice low. They seem to think, well, it's complicated. They said they've seen you taking notes and they're worried you might be. Nicole's heart pounded. Might be what? Tanya winced. That you might pose a security threat, she added quickly. I told them it was nonsense, but they're insisting they have to keep an eye on you. For a moment, Nicole was speechless. She wasn't sure if she felt more insulted or outraged. I'm just a passenger, she said slowly, choosing her words with care. I paid for my ticket. I haven't done anything. I know, Tanya said, her tone earnest. I believe you. It's not right. Let me try talking to the head flight attendant or the pilot, see if I can get them to stop this. Nicole nodded, waves of frustration rolling through her. She had done everything by the book. She'd cooperated, remained polite, and asked for help in the correct manner. Yet the flight crew, at least Vincent and Jonas, seemed dead set on painting her as a threat. Was it because of her silence, her discreet note-taking, or something deeper, like the color of her skin? She inhaled, her mind spinning with possible next steps. Confrontation was not her first choice, but she wasn't going to let this slide into an even more disturbing scenario. She wondered if it was time to reveal her credentials. The FAA taught inspectors to remain undercover except when necessary. But if the flight crew intended to escalate, Nicole clenched her jaw. She felt the plane dip slightly as it began its initial descent into New York airspace. The flight would be on the ground in less than an hour, but from the tension swirling in the pressurized cabin, it felt like an eternity away. As the plane descended, the mood in the cabin shifted from restless anticipation to quiet dread. A few passengers donned coats or packed up laptops, preparing for arrival. The usual clamor of seat belt buckles clicking and overhead bins opening was yet to come, but everyone sensed the flight was nearing its end. Nicole saw Tanya speak to the lead flight attendant, a stern-looking woman named Anita, who then beckoned Vincent and Jonas over. The group formed a tight circle near the cockpit door, conversing in low tones that occasionally spiked with raised eyebrows and anxious gestures. Nicole could imagine the conversation. Tanya might be advocating for her, while Vincent and Jonas likely stuck to their suspicions. Minutes later, the group broke apart. Anita walked back to the forward galley, looking troubled, while Vincent and Jonas exchanged a determined glance. Then, to Nicole's alarm, Jonas grabbed the interphone, a direct line to the ground. He spoke in hushed tones, presumably to airport staff or possibly even security. Nicole's pulse raced. Was this really happening? She replayed the flight in her head. She'd done nothing unusual, except possibly show too much attention to detail. If they had noticed her discreet note-taking or the FAA tag, perhaps they'd leapt to conclusions. Or was this racially motivated from the start? She had faced discrimination before, but not usually this brazen. In a post-9/11 world, flight crews were taught to err on the side of caution, but there was a line between caution and profiling. The pilot's voice broke the tension on the PAR system. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our final descent into New York's LaGuardia Airport. The local weather is clear, and we expect to be at the gate in approximately 25 minutes. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables and seat backs are in their full upright positions. We appreciate your cooperation. Passengers stirred, stowing items and adjusting seat belts. Nicole did the same, her mind spinning. She looked out the window. The dazzling Manhattan skyline glowed in the distance, overshadowed by a swirl of pink and orange clouds. Under different circumstances, she might have admired the view. Instead, her heart pounded with dread of what awaited her on the ground. She had never revealed her status mid-flight before, but perhaps now was the time. If this crew intended to call security, they'd be in for a rude awakening. Yet Nicole also knew that rashly brandishing her FAA badge could worsen the situation or overshadow the truth of how she'd been treated. Documenting the chain of events might be more powerful for the investigation if the airline staff went through with their plan. She decided to wait until they landed. The plane finally touched down with a squeak of rubber on runway tarmac. Passengers jolted forward with the deceleration. Some sighed in relief, others clapped out of habit. Nicole's hands trembled slightly on the armrests, not from fear of flying, but from the tension of what was about to happen. She glanced over to see Vincent and Jonas locked in conversation again as the plane taxied toward the gate. She thought about texting Darren, her colleague at the FAA, as soon as she had cell service. Maybe she should warn him that an incident was unfolding, but the seatbelt sign remained lit, and everyone was supposed to remain seated. Finally, the plane rolled to a stop at the gate. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood, opening overhead bins, collecting carry-ons, chatting about connecting flights or weekend plans. Nicole stayed seated, scanning the aisle. Her heart sank the moment she saw two uniformed security officers step into the cabin from the forward boarding door. Another officer waited just outside. The entire plane fell into a hush, with passengers craning their necks. Through the parted crowd, Nicole could see Vincent pointing directly at her. A flicker of fury ignited within her. All the stares, the whispers, the humiliating suspicion, now culminating in security being summoned for. What? Doing nothing except existing in her seat, a black woman on a flight. The realization stung, but Nicole summoned the composure she had cultivated through years of professional training. If this was the confrontation they wanted, so be it. She only hoped they were prepared for the truth she was about to reveal. "Ma'am," one of the security officers said as he approached Nicole's row, "we need to ask you a few questions." He was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, and though his tone was calm, Nicole sensed he was on high alert. His partner, a younger officer, stood a step behind him, eyes scanning the cabin warily. Around them, passengers looked on in stunned silence. Some whispered to each other. One woman clutched her purse nervously, as if expecting a dramatic takedown. Nicole tried to keep her voice steady. "Of course," she said, rising from her seat. Vincent hovered near the galley, arms crossed tightly. Jonas stood beside him, looking both anxious and resolute. Tanya and Anita lingered behind, their faces etched with concern. The mother with the toddler, the elderly couple from earlier, everyone watched, transfixed by the unfolding drama. The older officer gestured for Nicole to step into the aisle. She did so, carefully pulling her purse over her shoulder. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice even. "We've received a report from the flight crew that you may pose a security risk," the officer said, searching her expression. "We just need to verify some details, make sure everything's in order. Then we can have you on your way." Nicole inhaled slowly. She could see the shock and curiosity in the faces around her. This was the moment of reckoning. She glanced briefly at Vincent. His jaw was set, as if daring her to argue. The humiliation was almost overpowering, but Nicole reached into her purse. "I'm not a threat," she began firmly. "I'm Nicole Thompson, and I work for the Federal Aviation Administration." She pulled out her official credentials, a sleek ID card emblazoned with the FAA seal, and offered it to the officer. I'm on assignment to observe airline compliance. I have done nothing wrong here." A hush fell over the cabin as the officer took the ID, studying it carefully. His eyes widened, and he glanced at his partner, then back at Nicole. "Ma'am, are you telling me you're an FAA official?" "Yes," Nicole said. Her tone clipped. "I've been monitoring this flight as part of an investigation into passenger treatment and regulatory adherence. I had no intention of causing a scene, but it seems the scene has come to me." The younger officer leaned in, reading the ID. He shot a quick, surprised look at Vincent, who now seemed visibly uncomfortable. Jonas, too, looked like someone had snatched the rug from under him. The older officer cleared his throat. "All right, Miss Thompson. I apologize for the inconvenience. Let's step off the aircraft to discuss this in private." Nicole nodded, though part of her wanted to address the entire cabin at once, to call out the injustice of what had happened. But she followed the officer down the aisle, passing rows of passengers gawking at her. As they reached the front, she paused, meeting Vincent's gaze. "You accused the wrong person," she said quietly. Then she continued out the door and onto the jet bridge. In the cramped walkway, the officers asked a few more questions. Nicole explained her role, showed them additional documentation, and calmly recounted how she had been singled out. The older officer listened attentively, the color draining from his face. He apologized again. "Ma'am, we were told you were acting suspiciously, writing notes about the crew and ignoring direct orders. Obviously, that information appears to be inaccurate." Nicole released a shaky breath. "Yes, it is." Both officers glanced at each other, seeming at a loss. The older one finally said, "We need to file a brief report, but you're free to go. We have no grounds to detain you. We'll have to speak with the airline about this." Nicole nodded. "Believe me, there will be an investigation. Not by me personally, I'm just an inspector, but the FAA will want to know why their official was treated like a criminal." She tried to keep her tone professional, but her anger bubbled beneath the surface. The officers stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Behind her, passengers began to disembark, some sneaking glances at the tense standoff. The next moments would be crucial. She could confront Vincent and Jonas right there, or she could document everything carefully and let the official channels do their work. Nicole decided on the latter. She was no stranger to discrimination, but now she had the authority and the platform to seek accountability. As she moved down the jet bridge into the terminal, she felt a rush of conflicting emotions: rage, relief, vindication, and an aching sadness that these events were still so common. She clutched her purse strap, the FAA badge still in her hand. The flight crew had no idea just how extensively their actions might unravel once the formal inquiries began. For now, Nicole would focus on regaining her composure, but the storm had only just begun. Nicole stepped into the bustling terminal at LaGuardia. The throng of travelers hurried around her, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. She paused near a row of metal seats, trying to steady her trembling hands. In her line of work, she had seen flight attendants handle far tougher situations with grace, from medical emergencies to unruly passengers. And yet, a routine flight had devolved into a humiliating confrontation, apparently fueled by bias and unfounded suspicion. She dialed Darren's number, stepping to the side to avoid foot traffic. He picked up on the second ring. "Nicole? Everything okay?" She exhaled, pushing back tears of frustration. "Not exactly. I just got off a flight from O'Hare to LaGuardia, and let's just say the crew called security on me." "What?" Darren's voice spiked with disbelief. "You were traveling as an FAA inspector. Why would they?" "That's the question," Nicole said darkly. "They claimed I was suspicious, that I was writing notes. They completely ignored the possibility that I might be checking compliance. They only saw me as a threat." A pause stretched, and Nicole could imagine Darren rubbing his temple. "Give me the details. I'll escalate this to our superiors immediately." Nicole recounted the entire ordeal, from Vincent's early glances to the final humiliating walk off the plane with security officers. Darren listened intently, interjecting occasionally with clarifying questions. By the time she finished, he sounded furious. "You did the right thing not blowing your cover until the end," he said. "But this is a serious violation. They basically profiled you and then escalated to security without just cause. The FAA will definitely follow up. I'm sure the airline's management will hear about this. You need to file a detailed report." "That's my plan," Nicole said. "I'll document everything tonight." "Good. And, Nicole, I'm sorry you had to go through that. It's unacceptable, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure it's addressed properly." She thanked him, ending the call with a sense of solidarity. The FAA wasn't perfect, but it was a large organization capable of serious repercussions if airlines violated protocol or engaged in discriminatory practices. A single flight crew's prejudice could potentially tarnish the airline's record, triggering inspections and fines. Just then, she heard a hesitant voice behind her. "Excuse me, are you the woman from flight 717? Turning, she saw a middle-aged black woman clutching a carry-on. Her eyes shone with empathy. "Yes," Nicole replied softly. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. I'm so sorry. It wasn't right." The woman's gaze flicked to Nicole's FAA badge. "Are you really with the FAA?" Nicole nodded. "I am." The woman gave a tight smile. "Well, I hope you can make them pay for what they did. It was plain discrimination. I've been on the receiving end before. I'm just glad you have the power to do something about it." Nicole forced a grateful smile, though her heart still pounded with residual anger. "Thank you for your support. Please know this won't go unaddressed." They exchanged contact information, and the woman offered to provide a witness statement if needed. Such immediate solidarity heartened Nicole. It reminded her that for every person who discriminates, there are others willing to stand up for what's right. Collecting herself, Nicole moved through the terminal. She had another connecting flight to catch later that day, but first she intended to find a quiet corner and jot down every detail of the incident while it was still fresh. No matter how painful, she needed a clear record for her official report. She also felt a deep personal need to process the event, to transform her indignation into a call for change. As she settled into a quiet seating area near a coffee shop, she opened her laptop. The hustle of the airport swirled around her, but she focused on the screen. Words poured out, capturing each moment of tension, each microaggression, each blatant act of profiling. With every keystroke, she inched closer to reclaiming her narrative from those who tried to paint her as a criminal. When she finished, the weight on her chest felt a fraction lighter. She closed the laptop and leaned back, sipping a coffee. She reminded herself that justice moves slowly, but it does move. And karma, in its own time, would come knocking on the doors of those who had twisted her innocence into something sinister. 3 days later, Nicole found herself in a conference room at the FAA's regional office. The walls were adorned with framed certificates and posters detailing safety regulations. A projector screen on one side displayed a paused slideshow. Around a long table sat several FAA officials, including her supervisor, Marion Hughes, a dignified woman with graying hair pulled into a neat bun, and Darren, who looked both nervous and determined. At the front, Nicole prepared to present her findings. Not just the standard compliance observations, seatbelt demonstrations, emergency equipment checks, passenger interactions, but the alarming incident that overshadowed everything else. She had meticulously compiled statements, including contact information from the woman in the terminal who witnessed the ordeal. "All right, let's begin," Marion said, clicking a pen and making a note in her open folder. "Nicole, could you walk us through your report?" Nicole nodded, launching into her account of the flight. She described how the flight crew's suspicion escalated from uneasy glances to a confrontation with security. As she spoke, she projected relevant points onto a screen, time-stamped notes, airline policies, FAA guidelines for handling suspicious passengers. The faces around the table grew grave. Darren chimed in. "We've reached out to Omega Airlines for a statement. They initially claimed there was a misunderstanding about a passenger taking notes. But once they learned it was an FAA official, they quickly offered to settle any grievances." Nicole pressed her lips together. "That's corporate language for cover it up." She clicked to the next slide, showing flight regulations about passenger rights. They violated more than just basic courtesy. They essentially profiled me and then involved airport security without following the proper steps for verifying a threat. Marion looked solemn. "We take these matters very seriously. This is not just about one passenger's complaint. It's about how an airline handles potential bias situations. I'll be recommending a formal investigation and potential disciplinary actions for the crew involved." Nicole paused, feeling a surge of relief and validation. "Thank you," she managed to say quietly. She knew it wouldn't erase the humiliation she'd felt, but accountability was the first step toward preventing future incidents. As the meeting continued, they discussed possible outcomes: an official reprimand for Omega Airlines, mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for flight crews, and even potential fines if the investigation uncovered broader systemic issues. Nicole detailed how other passengers had also been mistreated, at least in small ways, revealing a pattern of the flight attendant's poor conduct. When the meeting adjourned, Marion patted Nicole's shoulder gently. "You did well, Nicole. This is never an easy topic, but it's crucial. We can't have this sort of behavior going unchecked." Darren walked Nicole to her office. "If you need any help drafting follow-up statements or dealing with the media, let me know," he said. "Word is already spreading internally. Some reporters might catch wind, especially if Omega tries to preempt the scandal." "Thanks, Darren," Nicole replied. She could already sense the emotional exhaustion creeping in. Despite the initial victory of being heard, she dreaded the possibility of a drawn-out PR battle. Omega Airlines might try to spin the story, claim it was a simple mistake. She steeled herself. The world needed to know that these mistakes weren't so simple when they stemmed from prejudice. That evening, as she sat at her desk, she received an email from Omega Airlines' corporate office. It was a carefully worded apology from a public relations official, stating they regretted any discomfort and would look into the matter internally. Nicole read it twice, feeling both vindicated and unsatisfied. Real change required more than a vaguely apologetic letter. It required confronting the roots of discrimination. Yet she sensed the gears of karma already turning. If the crew had hoped to silence or intimidate her, they had instead opened a door to scrutiny they would soon regret. She pictured Vincent's accusatory stare, Jonas's uneasy expression, and the airline's brand name stamped over their uniforms. It was only a matter of time before they faced the consequences of their actions. Setting her phone aside, Nicole looked out the window at the city lights. She thought of the countless passengers who didn't have an FAA badge to protect them from wrongful assumptions. People who were profiled daily for the color of their skin, their faith, or simply because they didn't fit someone's narrow expectation. Tonight, she resolved to push this investigation forward for them as much as for herself. A week later, Nicole sat in her apartment, scrolling through her inbox. Her phone buzzed with a call, an unknown number from Washington, D.C. She answered tentatively and was greeted by a crisp, authoritative voice. "Good afternoon, Miss Thompson. This is Carla Montoya from the FAA Office of Civil Rights. Nicole felt a jolt. She knew the Office of Civil Rights oversaw allegations of discrimination within the aviation sector. "Hello," she said, her tone polite but curious. "We've been briefed on your case," Carla explained. "We'd like to gather additional information to open a formal inquiry into Omega Airlines. We believe your testimony could be instrumental in determining whether systemic issues exist within their training and protocols." Nicole's heart thudded with both trepidation and excitement. "Absolutely. I'm more than willing to cooperate. I have a detailed report, plus statements from witnesses." "That's precisely what we need," Carla replied. "We'll also be requesting flight logs, crew records, and any relevant communications. Our aim is to ensure that no passenger, regardless of their background, faces such profiling again. Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes, of course," Nicole confirmed. This was a bigger step than she'd initially anticipated, but she welcomed it. A thorough investigation by the Office of Civil Rights could lead to substantial reforms, maybe even national headlines. After hanging up, Nicole stared at her phone, adrenaline coursing through her. Part of her feared the spotlight. Going against a major airline could become messy. But the greater part of her knew that systemic change often required risk. If her experience could help dismantle discriminatory practices, it would be worth the scrutiny. The following morning, she arrived at the FAA's main building in downtown Chicago for a scheduled video conference with Carla and her team. Darren joined as well. The meeting kicked off with introductions, and Carla walked them through the process. They would be reviewing not only Nicole's specific case, but also looking into prior complaints against Omega Airlines, patterns of staff misconduct, and evidence of insufficient diversity training. As for the flight attendants in question, Carla said, "We'll be requesting interviews with them. We want to understand their side, though we have reason to believe it won't exonerate them." Nicole felt a pang of relief. Finally, someone was shining a bright light on the problem, instead of letting it slide under miscommunication. She provided Carla's team with a comprehensive list of points: Vincent's repeated glares, Jonas's whispering, the overheard accusations, and the climatic call to airport security. She also handed over contact information for the witness who had approached her in the terminal. The entire session lasted nearly 2 hours, culminating in a plan of action. Carla's team would compile evidence, cross-reference flight records, and interview all relevant parties. Omega Airlines would be informed of the ongoing inquiry. If they tried to retaliate against employees who came forward or bury crucial information, the FAA could impose strict penalties. When the meeting concluded, Nicole felt equal parts drained and uplifted. She thanked Carla and ended the video call, exhaling deeply. Darren gave her a nod. "You did good. Let's hope this leads to something substantial." Nicole mustered a small smile. "Hope so. I just want accountability. That's all." As she packed her laptop bag, her mind drifted to Vincent, Jonas, Tanya, and Anita. Tanya might be praised for trying to mediate. Anita, who seemed uncertain how to handle the conflict, might face a reprimand for poor leadership. As for Vincent and Jonas, Nicole imagined their shock when they realized the passenger they'd profiled had triggered a federal inquiry. Karma, she thought, remembering the old saying that what goes around comes around. It might be slow, but it was definitely in motion. Nicole's only hope was that the outcome would serve as a lesson not just to Omega Airlines but to every carrier that ever mistook suspicion for prejudice. A month later, the FAA's Office of Civil Rights released preliminary findings. The official document landed in Nicole's inbox on a Wednesday morning, and she opened it with trembling fingers. Headed with the agency's seal, it summarized their investigation into Omega Airlines Flight 717 and included an overview of past complaints. She skimmed the key points. 1. Crew misconduct. The report concluded that Vincent and Jonas had exercised unjustified scrutiny toward Nicole, primarily based on her note-taking and her appearance. Their claims of feeling threatened lacked credible evidence. 2. Inadequate training. Omega Airlines had not thoroughly enforced the mandatory cultural sensitivity and anti-discrimination training outlined by the FAA. Multiple employees interviewed admitted that they'd only watched a cursory video module with no follow-up discussions or testing. 3. Previous incidents. While no single event was as serious as what happened with Nicole, there were half a dozen recorded complaints indicating patterns of racial or cultural bias from certain crew members over the past 2 years. 4. Recommended action. The Office of Civil Rights recommended fines against Omega Airlines, additional mandatory training for all crew, and direct disciplinary actions for Vincent and Jonas. They also suggested that Nicole be offered an apology and any necessary restitution for emotional distress. Nicole sat back in her chair, the magnitude of it sinking in. Her case had helped to illuminate deeper systemic issues, forcing the airline to confront them. She scanned further down, noticing an appended letter from Omega Airlines' executive board, which read like damage control, a formal apology, promises of policy revision, and a vow to provide better training. A swirl of conflicting emotions welled up within her, relief that the truth was validated, anger at the realization that she was far from the only one affected, and a cautious optimism that perhaps this would lead to lasting change. Still, she remained aware that corporate promises often ring hollow if not followed by concrete action. Later that day, Marion summoned Nicole and Darren to her office. The blinds were drawn to shield the mid-afternoon sun, and Marion gestured for them to sit. On her desk sat the same report Nicole had just read. "I wanted to congratulate you on your perseverance," Marion began. "The FAA rarely issues such a decisive preliminary report. Your thorough documentation made all the difference." Darren nodded in agreement. "You should be proud, Nicole." Nicole offered a small smile. "I'm relieved, but also, I don't want this to be the end. I want to ensure the airline truly implements these reforms. We can't let them do a quick PR spin and return to old habits." Marion folded her hands. "Agreed. That's why we'll require quarterly progress checks for a year at least. And if they fail to meet the standards, further penalties could follow." Nicole nodded, grateful. "That's good. Maybe it'll send a message to other airlines too, that they can't just profile passengers and call security for no reason." The conversation turned to whether Nicole wanted to press any personal legal claims against Omega. The FAA's actions covered regulatory angles, but as an individual, she could potentially sue for damages. Nicole hesitated. She wanted justice but didn't relish a public legal battle. "I'll think about it," she finally said, exhaling. "For now, I just want to focus on ensuring the recommendations are enforced." Marion and Darren understood, giving her supportive smiles. After the meeting, Nicole walked through the corridors, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Staffers nodded warmly, aware of the significance of her case. Still, behind her sense of relief lurked a reality. Prejudice wouldn't vanish overnight. There would always be those who saw a black woman and assumed the worst. Yet this time, her struggle had sparked real consequences and possibly a shift in how airlines handle bias. For that, she felt a glimmer of pride, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd silently endured similar injustices. She left the office building into a warm afternoon. The Chicago sun felt like an embrace on her skin. She stood on the sidewalk, scanning the skyline, letting the day's events wash over her. Maybe tomorrow would bring new challenges, But for now, she savored the small triumph of truth over fear. Karma had indeed come knocking, and it had demanded a reckoning. 2 months later, Nicole received a call from Denise Marshall, the newly appointed Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Omega Airlines, a position created in response to the FAA's investigation. Denise invited Nicole to speak on a corporate panel about bias and equity in aviation. At first, Nicole suspected a PR move, but she decided to attend, hoping her experience could drive meaningful change. Arriving at Omega's sleek headquarters, Nicole noticed a mix of employees, community activists, and aviation professionals gathered in an auditorium. On stage, panelists discussed everything from unconscious bias to actionable reforms. When it was her turn, Nicole recounted the harrowing flight, emphasizing that change couldn't stop at apologies or training videos. It demanded ongoing accountability and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. During the reception afterward, several Omega employees approached Nicole, including a young black woman eager to become a flight attendant. "Your story gives me hope," she said, eyes shining. Nicole offered encouragement, reminding her that it takes courage and a willingness to confront hard truths to reshape a flawed system. Finally, Denise found Nicole by the exit. "Thank you for coming," Denise said sincerely. "We're pushing for real reforms, and your voice matters." Nicole nodded, cautioning her to ensure these efforts didn't fade once public attention shifted. Denise promised vigilance. Stepping into the cool evening air, Nicole felt a guarded sense of hope. The airline that had wrongly profiled her was now opening its doors to reform. While corporate culture doesn't change overnight, Nicole couldn't deny that her ordeal had become a catalyst for progress. She looked up at the planes crossing the dark sky, imagining diverse passengers who deserved equal respect and safety. Her resolve hardened. As long as bias existed, she would keep fighting to root it out. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of one woman's fight for justice and the ripples it created throughout the airline industry. We followed Nicole Thompson, a dedicated Federal Aviation Administration official who was unfairly targeted on her flight just for doing her job and existing as a proud black woman. But through courage, resilience, and the power of truth, Nicole turned that injustice into a catalyst for real change. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to the hidden biases that can lurk in everyday life, we encourage you to take action. Share this video, leave a like to show your support, and be sure to subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on both the darkest and the brightest moments in our world. Together, we can make our skies and our communities more just and inclusive for everyone.